and not merely created an epoch in the history of the church, but determined the course of its history in the West up to the present day. He said he had a literary talent second to none in the annals of the church. And then he added, the whole development of Western life in all its phases was powerfully affected by his teaching. Now, one of the most remarkable things about his influence is that it has flowed into remarkably contradictory camps. So, for example, he is revered as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, father in the Roman Catholic Church. And Warfield said, Augustine gave us the Reformation. Now that's odd. He said that, quote, not only because Luther was an Augustinian monk, or that Calvin quoted Augustine more than any other theologian, but because the Reformation witnessed the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over the legacy of the Pelagian view of man. Both sides in the controversy, the Reformers and the Counter-Reformation, appealed on a huge scale to the texts of Augustine. There are unresolved issues in Augustine. One way of putting it that Warfield did use was, the Reformation was the triumph of Augustine's view of grace over Augustine's view of the church. I don't want to make much of that, but something like that is probably the case, because as I read his views on sacraments and baptism, I cannot put them together with some other things that he says, but that's for another time. I'm not expert enough in Augustine to resolve those things. There are reasons for why Augustine has had such a phenomenal impact. This biography here, written by a man named Augustine, although it's written Augustino Trape, called St. Augustine, Man, Pastor, and Mystic, where you can find a lot of very personal, this is kind of an anecdotal biography, a lot of personal things which are interesting. I like them as well. As long as I'm showing you books, let me just go ahead and show the rest. This is the main one I've leaned on, and probably is esteemed as the modern biography that is most authoritative. Peter Brown, Augustine of Hippo. It's a very, very good biography, in my judgment. And of course, this is his autobiography up to age 32, which are formative years, but the Confessions have, I probably in my talk here quote from the Confessions more than anything else. And they have this same edition of the City of God in the bookstore, unless they're all gone. But you can check those out. This is a good translation. I think you should read these in a modern translation. I have this thing about modernizing the Puritans. I don't like that. I don't like updated English versions of Jonathan Edwards or Owen. But I do like, if you've got to translate from Latin, do it in the contemporary idiom. Don't enshrine anybody's old translation of Augustine. So I enjoyed reading this one, remembering how I had read as a 19-year-old at Wheaton the Confessions of Augustine in another kind of English. In this one, Augustino Trape, he said something very, very good to explain his influence. Augustine was a philosopher, theologian, mystic, and poet in one. His lofty powers complemented each other and made the man fascinating in a way difficult to resist. He is a philosopher, but not a cold thinker. He is a theologian, but also a master of spiritual life. He is a mystic, but also a pastor. He is a poet, but also a controversialist. Every reader thus finds something attractive and even overwhelming: depth of metaphysical intuition, rich abundance of theological proofs, synthetic power and energy, psychological depth shown in spiritual ascents, and a wealth of imagination, sensibility, and mystical fervor. Now, I found that quote accurate and unexaggerated from my exposure to Augustine over the years. So, we all must, who undertake to say anything about this man, insert a disclaimer. Benedict Groeschel has written the most recent, that I know of, 1996, the most recent treatment of his works. And he went to Villanova University in his researches, where they have the Augustinian Heritage Institute, and was overwhelmed that there is a library of works on and by Augustine. Works on Augustine fill a library. And then he was exposed to the computer 5 million word discs that Augustine wrote. And of course he inserted his disclaimer. I wish I had jotted down in my readings, I only remember reading it, I didn't take a note on it, that somebody, even in Augustine's own day, said anybody who claims to have read all of Augustine is a liar. Here's what Groeschel says: I felt like a man beginning to write a guidebook of the Swiss Alps. After 40 years, I can still meditate on one book of the Confessions. It's divided into 13 books. On one book of the Confessions during a week-long retreat, and come back feeling frustrated that there is still so much more gold to mine in those few pages. I, for one, know that I shall never in this life escape from the Augustinian Alps. Well, that's true. Nevertheless, people visit the Alps. And so we're going to visit the Alps. And I just take heart from the fact that one can go to the Alps and spend an hour there and benefit from it and not have exhausted the Alps. So that's where we are. If you ask now, well, suppose I want to spend a little more time in the Alps when you're done, where should I go? I would say, as virtually everybody else would say, start with the Confessions. If you've never read Augustine's Confessions, you should. David Wells told me at supper last night he assigns this in his class on spiritual classics or classics of the Western Heritage or whatever the class is called. And anybody that leaves that book out of spiritual classics would, of course, be committing an error. Start there. Then the other 4 big books, famous books, are, number 1, On Christian Doctrine, which he wrote between 397 and 426. The Enchiridion, on Faith, Hope, and Love, which Warfield says is his most serious attempt to systematize his thought. On the Trinity, written over another 25-year period, which gave definitive formulation to the Trinity for years. And then The City of God, which he spent about 29 years writing. No, not 29 years. From 413, I was doing my math wrong. From 413 to 426, 13 years. So let's go on a little short tour here. I'm very eager to get to my thesis, but I want also to weave it into his life. So I'm torn as to how to proceed, but I'll weave them together the best I can. What I have seen and what I want to preach when we get to it is tremendously important, I believe, for our day. For me personally, it's tremendously important, and I think the Lord is putting together a conference here with what David Wells is saying And what Alistair Begg said